Good morning. My name is David Buwalda, and I'm here with Joe Nelson. We're here to discuss today the book ICA Canada has recently published, and Joe and her late husband Wayne have recently written, called Getting to the Bottom of ToP. And we're going to spend some time with Joe this morning asking some questions about this and hearing about how the book came about and learning about what you might use the book for. And getting some examples, we hope, of great ways to use it.
Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming. And I'll let you know we're sitting in ICA Associates and ICA Canada's training room here in Toronto, Canada. How did this book come about for you?
Well, Wayne was concerned that people who use ICA methods, ToP methods, may be losing the core understanding of them, and definitely the history of how they came about. So he determined that somebody needed to interview all of the old hands who helped develop the methods and look in the archives and do the research to find out where they came from in order to hold that wisdom. And so he did about 6 years of research on this and had put the skeleton of the book together, and had done the work on the underlying theory, and had actually, the week before he died, he gave me a copy of the chapter on phenomenology, and I read it and said, oh my God, I understand this for the first time after 40 years of using it. And then that weekend he died, so suddenly of a heart attack. So I determined to finish the book, and luckily he'd written the chapters on the really heavy philosophical part, which I'm not good at, and what was left was the skeleton of the applications, which is something I've been doing for 45 years, so I knew very well.
Okay. So you answered this one a little bit, but I'm wondering, when you were going through the later stages of the book, editing it and writing it on top of that skeleton, to whom were you writing the book for?
Two audiences. One is all of the people who are ToP trained in the world, or know of ToP methods and really want to know what's the magic. What is it that makes them work? Why do they work in so many cultures? Why do they work even when the facilitators aren't very good? And the other was university professors, because people are trying to teach facilitation in universities these days, and there's a dearth of really good material about the underlying understandings that can help people in facilitation. So there were two very different audiences for this.
As you're writing it, is that something you're really aware of, or is it something you feel like you come out after the book was finished?
No, I absolutely have both in mind as I was writing. And Wayne, well, I don't know what Wayne had in mind exactly. We didn't discuss that a lot. I think his was more about ToP, people who use ToP, and having them understand what the underlying foundations were. Because that's the subtitle of the book, is Foundations of the Methods of the Technologies of Participation.
Okay. I wonder if someone has only a very brief introduction to technology of participation, to ToP methodology, would they still find a way to use this book, or?
Yeah, but they won't want to start with the first 4 chapters. They're going to want to start with probably the chapter on the focused conversation method, because the first 4 chapters are pretty heavy. In fact, some people tell me they read them 2 or 3 times before they get it. But it's still accessible in the way that phenomenology is not accessible. And I think that it's one of the few books that I've been able to find on applied phenomenology. There are people who study phenomenology and they write in phenomenally obscure terms, and there's at least one really good book on phenomenology that's easy to access, but not very many people write about applying that understanding of the thinking process in everyday life. So a newbie would probably go to the practical chapters, and then say, "Oh, does this work? Okay, I'll go back to the underlying."
Right. So with a little bit of more experience of using those methods, you would become more interested or more
more interested in why they work.
more involved in how they work, and those
In fact,
four
the
chapters might come
introduction to the book says, you don't have to read this in order. You can go to any chapter look at the table of contents, chart it. That's one of the methods. Just go to the one that makes most sense to you to start with.
Right. You can apply your own phenomenology to the book.
Yep.
What about someone who's a seasoned pro, someone who's done facilitation as a professional for many years, using ToP or maybe even using other methods? How would they find this book powerful?
Well, I just talked with a whole lot of ToP practitioners in the U.S. At a ToP gathering just this weekend, and they have been asked. I had 30 people come to a session I did on it. They're the ones who are asking the deep question: why do these methods work? So people who are ToP practitioners, especially people who have used them a lot and figured out how to adapt them, but don't know the core. They're the ones who are most interested in this. And I think of this as like learning to play jazz. To play jazz, you need to have a real understanding of 8-bar blues and the structure of music, particularly 8-bar blues. And then you can riff on top of it. So people who are doing ToP facilitation and want to do innovation need this in order to understand the foundations so they can riff on the underlying foundation. People who are not ToP practitioners but have seen it or heard of it want to know why it has such a following and why it works. I mean, all those people who want to know why it works, that's what this is what it's for. And very interestingly, the phenomenology, I mean, ToP methods are not just a specific body of certain tools. There are certain tools that are created on the underlying foundations. Many methods follow those underlying foundations. I worked with OTs. They said, "Oh, this is the way OTs think."
OTs?
Occupational therapists. Counseling. People come up to me and say, "Oh, this is counseling methods that work. Follow this underlying process." So understanding the underlying process allows people to make their own processes work better and make more sense to people. Because the phenomenology is the word means the structure of thought. And so starting with what is, Heidegger's the quote from Heidegger is something like, "Pay attention to what is." And if you start with what is, and then you work through your associations with that and memories, and then exploring the meaning and then making decision, you make wise decisions really easily. And many methods follow that underlying process.
I wonder for you, as a professional, you said 45 years?
47 years.
47 years. I thought I was going too high. 47 years of experience.
I actually learned these methods first in 1966, which is 51 years ago. But anyway, I only used them for 47 years.
So, having used them and known about them for
half a century,
you have, and you've spent the last couple of years intensely writing this book about them and examining them. Has your practice of using ToP methodology changed at all from writing this book?
Yes, I am more conscious of what I am doing at each stage, and I'm more conscious of watching how people naturally flow from one step to the other. It's more affected how I teach it, because I'm not afraid to teach the underlying process. I spent quite a bit of time this weekend separating the focused conversation method, for which people use ORID as an acronym, and separating that from ORID, which is really the underlying foundational understanding and conversation method as a tool. And there were a lot of ahas as I did that. So It's made me much more conscious of the physicality or the sensory nature of the objective level that we start with, and very clear to start with something that is tangible and concrete, so that people aren't making assumptions at the first level. They are observing what is.
Mm-hmm.
I've lost some of my naivete, but that has to do with world events as I'm writing this. So the question becomes, so how do you know that it is actually an observable thing, or it's a word you've just heard, or a phrase you've just heard? You know, what's the difference between real objectivity and fake objectivity? Not to use the word fake news. But there are ways to do that too. Yeah. And I also, there's another principle that ICA has used for years that I've never been able to explain before, which is grounding. When you take an abstraction and you say, what does this look like in real life? And that's a real gift that ICA has brought to things in ToP methods. It is the phenomenological method that allows you to do that. Because you start with an abstraction, say a mission statement, and you say, here's this phrase, what word, I just read it out loud, there's the objectivity. What triggers for you? What associations you have? What does this look like in real life at the interpretive stage? And then how are you going to act this out? And you can really make mission statements alive. And I understood finally how that particular part of our methodology fits with the rest.
I see.
Does that make sense?
I think it does. It reminds me of when people use, and I think they use it more and more often now, the word gestalt as a verb. And they said, I gestalted this and I gestalted that. There's a comparison here with...
Well, and the gestalt is at the reflective level, because you are seeing associations and patterns. Naming the patterns is the next level.
Right.
So it's made me more clear about where things are in the process.
Okay. I'd like to know a little bit, like you said, you first experienced or learned about the ToP approach in the 60s.
Yep.
And you worked with ICA in different ways in those 47 years of practice. And there was one part of the book that talks about a community in Egypt. You tell a story about a community you worked with in Egypt, and how using the ToP methodology in that community helped build a culture of participation. And I know that a culture of participation, this is a good example, is part of the mission of ICA Canada and ICA Associates. I wonder how that story relates to the overall power of a ToP methodology.
I'm not sure which story you were thinking about from Egypt, but one way that it works is that when we did the consultation with the community, the village, in order to plan their own future, we brought them through our strategic thinking process, which is a problem-solving process that follows observing, noting your reactions, interpreting, making decisions. It's a little more abstract level of how it applies that underlying phenomenological method. But using that as a planning method with the community allowed people to use it as a problem-solving method, and they continue to.
That's exactly the story. Well, I can't remember the details.
I can't remember which story you were. I have too many stories.
For ICA Canada's work in community, it's often much a surprise how easily a community who's decided to make a change participate in that problem solving. How important is it in this phenomenological approach, or using the ToP methodology, that people be really aware of the process, to be effective participants in that process?
I don't think the facilitator has to necessarily tell the group what process they're going to go through. The group will experience it as a natural process. what I love is when I'm using a focused conversation method and people answer my next question just before I ask it, because I've designed it in such a way that the brain is unfolding, it's thinking as it goes. And so people, once one level of question is answered, people naturally flow to the next one. It is so much fun to just watch people naturally follow the process. Now, if people are going to lead a group, they need to know and be conscious of the process. The process itself is a process of developing consciousness. So at the objective level, you're just aware of what goes on around you. Now that in itself is a discipline, because as I said to the group the other day that I was working with in Chicago, or in Omaha, I said, how many people can tell me the color of the wall in the hall outside this room? Nobody could remember, except the people who could see out the door. Because we're not always conscious. We can't be conscious of everything that's around us. So bringing the objective level to awareness and sharing it is being conscious of what's around us. The next level that we're often not conscious of, but is critical for the further thinking, is our consciousness of our reactions. What are the associations we have with something? And because those determine a lot of how we interpret, which is the next level, how we interpret the meaning of a situation. But if we're not aware or conscious of what is triggered for us, it can skew what we're, and we can't choose, the last stage, choose to relate to the meaning of it, because we're as long as it's not conscious, we are manipulated by our own previous associations. So, if I see someone comes into a room that I'm working in, and they remind me of my bossy older sister, I might interpret that when they tell me something, they're being bossy. But if haven't brought to consciousness the fact that just because they have red hair reminds me of my sister, and therefore I can separate myself from my interpretation of who they are and what they're intending.
Right.
And therefore I can take a different relationship to them.
Right.
Sometimes it makes me chuckle because I'll only figure out what the association is sometime later. But so each of these stages is a stage of consciousness. Consciousness of consciousness, consciousness of consciousness of consciousness, and then choosing to be conscious.
Right.
And that when you're aware, when you see that process going on and are aware, are conscious of that, to use the word again, of that process going on in your own mind, then you can be much more intentional about how you are in the world.
So
this process, when Wayne died, was very helpful to me to note what was going on, what the triggers were, why I was reacting in that way, and then to choose whether I was going to do that or do something else. For example.
Right. It reminds me the way you've described using it in that case, and in the case of your office with the redheaded person, that it's not just about a way of thinking for groups.
No.
This is a way of understanding your own work. And I wonder...
This is human way of thinking.
This is human way of
I
thinking.
call it how people think clearly when they think clearly. Because we don't always think clearly.
Right.
But when we do, we almost always follow a process like this.
There's an element of the book that would lead to someone using it also to think about in their own exploration of mindfulness, or appreciative inquiry, or in the fields of...
Like I said, any process that works probably follows something like this. These philosophers, they didn't like philosophy. They didn't want to start with the abstract and then draw stuff from it. They started with what was real, what they could see, touch, hear, and then moved from there. So, yeah.
So as a practitioner and as a person living in the world, the book, Getting to the Bottom of ToP, gives you some ways of being conscious of your own consciousness.
And it gives you intentionality.
Intentionality.
And you're not as reactive. Well, you have your reactions, but you note them and then you can choose to follow them or not. So it makes you a much pleasanter person in the world, I think.
I have one last question. Is having written the book, it's published just in the last month, and I wonder, in editing it, what was the hardest part not to include?
I don't know that I can answer that question. What my focus in editing was to keep Wayne's voice in the parts that he'd written, and then to make clear in the other parts of the way I can make things clear in the rest of the book. So that was really my focus in editing. I didn't think in writing or editing what to add or take out particularly directly.
Okay. Well, from ICA Canada's perspective, we're very proud to publish this book. Very proud to be sharing office with the author. But we're also very glad, for the same reason that I think you and Wayne started writing the book, that we have a clear and broad understanding of where those ToP methodologies come from. And we encourage people in our offices, our partner offices around the world, to have a copy of this and be able to share this as well.
And some of them got their copies before I even got mine, so it's working.
Well, thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you.
And see you tomorrow.
Okay.